Peter was always the brightest of my mother's children, although there may have been a prodigy or two sprung forth from the overactive loins of Pa without her help. On blackout nights at her house during the 80s, my mother would gather us around a lamp, and while my father was either out drinking with friends or thrusting furiously into some hapless girl as gullible and slim and as smitten as his wife once was, have the five of us play quiz games using an old and battered copy of the Student's Companion. In eloquence, I've come to believe, is much more than a deficiency of expression. Faced with a greater, overwhelming eloquence, it will often mutate into a deficiency of formulation. This is true of emotional ineloquence as it is of intellectual ineloquence. Communal fanaticism, tribal rage, thrives more on this mutation of ineloquence than it does in true ignorance. The clearest memory I have of Peter in his youth, before the bitterness, was from those blackout nights with her mother quizzing us from that handed-down Student's Companion. I hear her voice, thin and echoing, ghost-like, fading away into its own ellipsis, a place where birds are kept, and Peter's image stands out in dramatic candlelit relief, surrounded by the haze of the rest of my siblings, as he asserts without fail, an aviary. So it would go through apiary, aquarium, hutch, warren, sty, insectarium. It is not that the rest of us did not learn all the answers over time. We did. But long before we did, and long after, our original ignorance and relative ineloquence had become incorporated into that familial ritual. In the end, Pitamber became the spokesman for all of us. The single correspondence between Peter and I in the 9 years since I left for Canada was a short, cryptic letter he sent me, just as Hawk had entered its infancy. I have it in my Toronto apartment still. Indeed, I know it from memory by now. What is an aviary, Prakash? An aviary is a place where birds are kept. Where birds are kept despite plumage and temperament and origin. All that is important is that they can mutually endure their confinement for no greater purpose than some perverse and unnatural exhibition. My name is Ruel Johnson. I come from a tiny country in South America called Guyana. We're known for being the only English-speaking country in South America, and we have much more in common with the Anglophone Caribbean, countries like Jamaica and Barbados and Trinidad. What I do? I write. In my spare time, I write as much as I can, both fiction and poetry, but I also have been working on some screenplays. My official job, what I do for a living, which I've done unofficially. Well, my official job is that I advise on cultural policy for the Ministry of Education in Guyana, which also covers culture. It's a sort of an extension or continuation of advocacy work I've been doing for a fairly long time. And so when there was a change in government, I was asked to come on board and sort of transmute my advocacy into actual policy formulation. We've had a history of both producing, I would say, world-class writers, originally from Guyana, but a suppression of really free literary content at home. What that's resulted in is the fact that much of Guyanese history has been left unexamined by literature. And so the best thing for now, and our reforms in government have been increasingly fluctuating, but now they're at a point in which there could be, I think, quantifiably more democratic than, say, in the past 10 years. What's the result of it is that there's a new generation of writers who now have an opportunity not just to examine contemporary Guyanese reality, but also look at and turn their imagination to these vast swathes of history that have been unexamined not just by literature, but also by history, historiography itself. So that is the most, I think, exciting and the best thing about writing from Guyana now. The worst thing is that that very same system of either outright suppression or what I like to call sort of malign neglect of literary infrastructure for the production of literature, means that much of what it takes to produce literature, technical capacity building programs, the curriculum in schools, publishing facilities are non-existent in Guyana, although we do have the Guyana Prize for Literature, which is a major prize. Outside of that, and despite that, in fact, we have virtually no infrastructure. Easy, that's the best thing about us is our cultural and ethnic diversity. We have people from virtually all over the world, I think in more equitable quantities than exist elsewhere. And that is increasingly evolving to be so, in the fact that we're at the stage wherein we've gone from having, because of that diversity and because of a history of colonialism, sort of very rabid ethnic competition as expressed in its politics, in our politics. So what we've had is that we have the diversity as a strength, but we have also had the diversity as our greatest weakness. So we're at the point, and this is where I think literature comes in to help provide some sort of equilibrium. We can have, particularly in a world where you see this sort of cultural conflict finding increasing currency, I think that we have lessons for what's going on right now, because even as we've been dysfunctional, we're not, I won't say yet, but we have never descended into a truly failed state. We've been on the brink several times, but we've not descended there. So yeah, our diversity is both the best thing and the worst thing about us. I like this show Californication, and there was a quote that the main character said, I drink, I think, I type. that is largely the process. Much of the writing I've done here, in Iowa City, for example, has been done in bars up to last night. And you sort of flow when it is that you're relaxed and you're... so that is its own rush in itself. I guess as with most writers, the major challenge is when it is that you are in that flow, anything that interrupts it, whether it is the reality of work, reality of family life, or just having to, I guess, deal with the external world. I like to say that you used a word earlier that I've often used myself. I mean, my friends over the years have accustomed to me being social, and then they don't hear from me like 2 weeks, and nobody can call me, nobody can contact me, and that I usually call that period my hibernation. Of course, I'm doing anything but hibernating. I'm doing a great deal of work, and so usually, I'm particularly in a country that people are not accustomed to the process of literature. The people that are closest to me have often wondered, I mean, how is it you have a book? Or how did you have these stories? And when did you do this particular work? But it's usually an accumulative process, and then I just shut away and try to avoid the distractions. The question, I'm guessing, is that whether a writer's writing has a public duty. And that is usually the dichotomy. Is it art for art's sake or art for social purpose? The thing is, writers, and you've seen it in people like Václav Havel, for example. And he spoke about this sort of myth of specialization where some people are basically have to deal with the world's pressures directly, and some people are specializing just writing about it in his writing. A writer has an aesthetic role. It has to do with art, an examination of issues, large issues like beauty and greater, less transient questions of existence, etc. But if you're writing about existential concerns and people are being shot down in the streets, who are you writing for? So I've seen it as my duty to write poetry about my personal life, about the things that impress me. But I've also seen it write both poetry and fiction about very direct things, very precise and present issues that I think have resonance overall. So, and I've written about that in the newspapers, for example, letters, columns, etc. And I think that a writer has a particular talent of, and the excerpt I just read was about the whole concept of, if it is that this sort of tribal divisive eloquence dominates this space, and you see it happening in America right now, then what happens is that it's not that others who are less vocal don't eventually get to a point where they know the answers, but it sort of dwarfs and atrophies a response to the tribalism. And for me, the role of a writer, particularly in a society as ours that has been tribal, is to sort of shout down those voices. And yeah, that's been my public role. I think that the states, and that's why I work in policy, I think that states should support the policy framework that makes an environment for the creation of literature possible. We have a Guyana Prize for Literature, and how it was originally designed, yes, it was designed to mitigate bias, etc. But its funding still depends primarily on the state. And so if it is that, and it's happened in the past, if they don't want to host a prize because they don't like the people like myself who've won it, they withdraw. What the state should do is create the environment. We have copyright legislation, for example. Our copyright legislation is 60 years old and completely ineffective. My task, working with the state, is to create copyright policy that supports the viable production of literature. So in that way, yes, the state should support literature, but only in creating the environment in which the creation of literature is possible. I write, as I said, I write poetry, and I think the text that has been, I think, most influential for me as a writer is a massive book-length poem by Derek Walcott called Another Life, and which sort of is I think the poetic equivalent of Bildung's roman, and it traces his development in St. Lucia, his artistic development, to his life in the U.S. and his engagement with the society. And he spoke about being blessed with a new world naked, with Adam's gift of giving name to things. And as I said, in Guyana, we're a society in which that literature has not been able to exercise itself. So for me, as somebody who now started writing about, I was about 16, 17, reading Another Life, and seeing sort of a parallel of what is possible in creating a literature of place. And Walker deals with a literature of place in other poems. Like he has one called Hick Jacket, which influenced me not just to write about the place, but more importantly, to stay in the place as I'm writing about it. Because very often we have the what I call absentee literocracy, wherein people spend a very small time in the place, but then go and sort of behave as if they have a lease on explaining that place in literature that is very often far removed from the experience of that place over time. Certainly time to write has been critical to helping me to produce stuff. I've had to go buy a new notebook last night because the one I have, and I've had for years, is quickly filling. The being here, however, I've always had a sort of tangential interest in American politics and American culture, as is inevitable. However, being here has given me the sort of insight that sort of propelled me into working less on the screenplays that I focus on finishing, and looking towards a non-fiction project that deals with this particular capsule of time in America and its particular significance. And I started playing around with the whole concept of fall, as in the season, and sort of parallel to the sort of what I see, it seems to be a consensus that American politics has sort of descended. So the working title for now is called An American Fall, and it examines those issues in a variety of fronts, and as informed by the places we've traveled to. So Washington and New York should be extensively fruitful, but we've being in New Orleans, for example, and seeing the parallels of the plantation economy and how that has sort of still has resonance for today in America, as the plantation economy in Guyana still has resonance today in Guyana. For example, we were at a plantation, and not far from that was another one used to call Angola, which became transformed into was today the Angola prison. And in Chicago, we were at a talk by Albert Wood Fox, who was recently released from Angola, because of Black Panther activities in the 70s. There's currently a documentary out called 13th, which speaks on the 13th Amendment, which sort of covers the transition from involuntary slavery to slavery that is allowable, essentially as a consequence of being convicted, being a convicted criminal. And there's a lot of dynamic that goes on. The commercial prison system, high incarceration rates disproportionately for African Americans, for example. That still has resonance today, and that is having a peak resonance in this period. So there's a lot of things that are going on that I don't think, quite frankly, an American writer being part of the system would not necessarily observe in its totality. This program has been invaluable. I think that it offers, going forward, an opportunity because of how unique it is and how expansive it is. I don't think there's anyone like it in the US. It offers an opportunity for, I think, America to have not just a new engagement with the rest of the world, but with America itself. If it is that the voices, and if it is that there's a medium for taking advantage of the perspectives that people have coming into here, and not just into the program, but into American society. You have the benefit of writers and multiple perspectives on this very powerful and very important country. fanaticism, tribal rage, thrives more on this mutation of an eloquence than it does in true ignorance. The clearest memory I have of Peter in his youth, before the bitterness, was from those blackout nights with her mother quizzing us from that handed-down student's companion. I hear her voice, thin and echoing, ghost-like, fading away into its own ellipsis, a place where birds are kept. And Peter's image, and as smitten as his wife once was, have the five of us play quiz games using an old and battered copy of the student's companion. In eloquence, I've come to believe, is much more than a deficiency of expression. Faced with a greater, overwhelming eloquence, it will often mutate into a deficiency of formulation. This is true of emotional ineloquence as it is of intellectual ineloquence. Coming Peter was always the brightest of my mother's children, although there may have been a prodigy or two sprung forth from the overactive loins of Pa without her help. On blackout nights at her house during the 80s, my mother would gather us around a lamp, and while my father was either out drinking with friends or thrusting furiously into some hapless girl as gullible and slim stands out in dramatic candlelit relief, surrounded by the haze of the rest of my siblings, as he asserts without fail, an aviary. So it would go through apiary, aquarium, hutch, warren, sty, insectarium. It is not that the rest of us did not learn all the answers over time. We did. But long before we did, and long after, our original